My name is Daniel Mercer, and this is the story of the day I quietly became a ghost in my own life. For 11 years, I was married to Heather, a woman I once thought was my best friend. We lived just outside of Denver, in a quiet suburb where everyone smiled and waved but barely knew each other's names. Heather and I were the kind of couple that people pointed to as stable, maybe even a little boring, but solid. We had a nice home, good jobs. She worked as a senior nurse at a private clinic. I was in IT consulting. We didn't argue often, but what people didn't see was the slow erosion happening between us. It wasn't a sudden collapse. That would have been easier to name, easier to grieve. Ours was a soft decay, like wood eaten from the inside by termites. It started when we began trying to have kids, and nothing happened. For almost 3 years, we tried everything: timed ovulation, hormone treatments, adoption discussions. Every cycle that failed took something invisible from us. First, it was laughter, then eye contact, then the warmth in her voice when she said my name. Eventually, Heather stopped trying, not just to get pregnant, but to even connect. She was still physically present, but emotionally absent. And I stayed, because I believed love meant endurance, even when it hurt. Then came Monica, Heather's younger sister. A firecracker in her 30s with no filter and a messy divorce on her hands. She showed up at our door one rainy Thursday night, two kids in tow, a bag in each hand, and tears streaming down her face. Heather barely looked at me before saying, "Just for a few nights." She needs a place to crash. Of course, I agreed. How could I say no? But a few nights turned into 3 months. Monica never left. Her boys took over the living room with plastic swords and cracker crumbs. She blared reality TV through the walls while I tried to finish work calls. Her laundry mixed with ours. Her presence became a third gravitational force in our house, and Heather, God help me, treated it like it was completely normal. I started to feel like a guest in my own home. The final straw didn't come with a fight. No one yelled or slammed a door. It came during a family BBQ that Heather hosted one sunny Saturday in June. I didn't even know about it until I pulled into our driveway after a long day at the office and saw folding chairs and balloons in the backyard. Inside were faces I half recognized from holidays and weddings: cousins, aunts, people whose names I forgot but who remembered mine. Someone shoved a paper plate in my hand. Someone else handed me a beer, and I went with it, because what else do you do when your house is suddenly a festival? Then came the moment. I was standing near the grill, flipping a burger, trying to pretend I didn't feel utterly invisible, when Monica's voice sliced through the air like a blade dipped in acid. She laughed and said, "Honestly, if Daniel disappeared tomorrow, I don't think anyone would even notice." The backyard erupted in laughter, including Heather. My wife, the woman I gave 11 years of my life to, she didn't even flinch. I stared at her. She met my eyes, but only for a second, long enough to give me a shrug and that same smile she'd once used to tell me she loved me. Now it just felt empty. That night, after everyone had left and the house was filled with wine bottles and discarded party napkins, I went upstairs, opened my closet, and pulled out the duffel bag I hadn't touched in years. I packed the basics: passport, cash, a few clothes, documents. Heather was already asleep, or pretending to be. I left the divorce papers on the kitchen table. I'd had them prepared months ago but hadn't signed them. Until that moment. I added a yellow sticky note on top. It read, "You noticed yet?" Then I walked out the door, and no one stopped me. No one even saw me go. I became what Monica joked about, a man who disappeared. The only difference: it wasn't a joke, it was a decision. The first time I met Heather's younger sister, Lily, I thought she was charming in a chaotic sort of way. She had this wild energy about her, unfiltered, loud, opinionated, and oddly magnetic. But she also had a way of pulling all the air out of the room and making everything about her. When she arrived at our door in the middle of a rainy Tuesday with her two young sons, suitcases in tow and makeup streaked from crying, I felt an instant knot in my stomach. "She just needs a few days, Daniel," Heather said, her voice trembling with empathy. "She's going through a rough patch." "You remember Chad, her husband? He cheated, left her with nothing." Of course I remembered Chad. He was a sleazebag from day one, but this wasn't about him. This was about the tornado of disruption now camped in our guest room. Those few days turned into weeks. Weeks slid into months, and slowly, without ever formally discussing it, Lily just stayed. Her boys, 7 and 4, treated our house like a playground with no boundaries. Couch cushions became fortresses. Cereal was ground into the carpet. Their toys were everywhere, from the living room to our master bedroom. One morning, I even found one of their action figures floating in my coffee mug. Heather changed too. She became defensive, on edge. Whenever I brought up the lack of boundaries or how our home was morphing into a madhouse, she shut me down. Daniel, she's family. She has nowhere else to go. What kind of people would we be if we threw them out? I didn't want to throw them out. I wanted a timeline, a plan, something, but any time I even suggested it, I was met with silence or a guilt trip. Lily, meanwhile, seemed to settle in without shame. She'd hog the television, order food with our credit card like it was hers, and even started inviting friends over during the day. The noise, the clutter, the chaos. It was like our sanctuary had been converted into a daycare center crossed with a reality TV set. Worse, Lily had this way of pushing my buttons on purpose. She'd make sly comments in front of Heather like, "You're lucky your man's not totally useless," followed by a sarcastic smirk. Or she'd mock my cooking, my music taste, the way I folded laundry. Nothing was off limits. And the more I tried to ignore her, the more emboldened she became. Heather never once stood up for me. She'd laugh nervously, change the subject, or pretend she didn't hear. It was like I had become a visitor in my own home. The tension started eating at me from the inside. I'd stay at work late just to avoid coming home. I started sleeping in the basement to get better rest, but really because I couldn't bear to lie next to someone who refused to defend me. Our bed didn't feel like ours anymore. It felt like neutral ground in a silent war. One Saturday afternoon, I came home to find Lily lounging on the couch, feet up, watching one of those reality shows where people scream at each other for sport. Heather was cooking in the kitchen, and the kids were chasing each other with foam swords down the hallway. "Hey, could you maybe not use the couch as your throne?" I said, trying to keep it light. Lily didn't even look at me. "Aw, is someone feeling unimportant again?" she quipped. I stood there, blinking. "Excuse me?" Heather turned, spatula in hand, her eyes darting between us. "Lily, don't," she said softly, like a teacher correcting a student. But it was too late. The message had been delivered. That was the moment I knew the problem wasn't Lily, it was Heather. She had chosen her sister over me, not once or twice, but consistently. My concerns weren't seen as valid. They were inconveniences to be minimized. I wasn't her partner anymore. I was collateral damage in her attempt to play savior. That night, after the kids were asleep and the house was finally quiet, I sat outside on our back porch, staring into the darkness. I thought about how long I had been holding my breath in this relationship, how many times I had swallowed my pride, made space, conceded ground, hoping, praying that Heather would see me, but she never did. And deep inside, a small voice whispered something I hadn't let myself say out loud until now. "You deserve better." That's when I opened my phone and started looking for storage units. The weeks that followed were a slow-burning spiral into chaos. It wasn't just the noise, it was the invasion. Little by little, Daniel's home stopped feeling like his own. The once peaceful rhythm of quiet breakfasts, his morning runs through the tree-lined neighborhood, and the silence of evening dinners was now shattered by tantrums, toys underfoot, and conversations dominated by Heather's sister, Marlene. Marlene had a way of taking up space, loud, unapologetic, sharp-tongued, and somehow always managing to make everything about her. She treated the guest room like her master suite, dumped her laundry into the shared basket without asking, and left makeup and hair tools sprawled across the bathroom counter. But it wasn't just her, it was Heather. Daniel had once thought their marriage was built on respect. They didn't always agree, but when things got hard, they'd talk. They'd listen. But now, every attempt Daniel made to discuss the situation was met with dismissal. "She's going through a lot right now," Heather would say, not even looking up from her phone. Just be patient. She needs us. Us? Daniel had asked once. Or is it just me putting up with her because you're too scared to say anything? That got him silence. Or worse, a sigh. The kind of sigh that says you're the problem, not the one dealing with it. By the end of the second month, Daniel had moved permanently to the downstairs study. What began as him giving space just for a night became his new normal. His pillow was thin and worn, his mattress an old fold-out couch that creaked every time he shifted. Marlene's kids took over the upstairs with their screeching games and messes. One afternoon, Daniel found crayon drawings on the hallway walls. When he brought it up to Heather, she waved him off. They're just kids, don't be dramatic. That was the new Heather. Detached, edgy, defensive. And Daniel was tired. He came home one evening after a brutal day at work. He was juggling two major projects, working overtime just to meet deadlines. He dreamed of coming home to quiet, maybe reheating leftovers, watching something dumb on TV. Instead, he walked into a war zone. Toys littered the living room. Spilled juice soaked into the couch cushions. The air reeked of microwaved mac and cheese. The kids were screaming upstairs, and Marlene was on the phone in the kitchen, laughing loudly while opening a bottle of wine that Daniel had bought for their anniversary 2 months ago. She hadn't even asked. But the final straw came when Daniel turned toward the fridge. A drawing was taped to the door, a stick figure family. Marlene's two kids, her and Heather. Daniel was nowhere to be seen. He stared at that childish scribble longer than he'd care to admit. His heart sank. It was just paper and marker, he told himself. But it spoke volumes. He took a breath and walked into the dining room, where Heather was scrolling through her tablet. He stood silently until she noticed. "What's wrong now?" she asked. "That drawing," he said, "on the fridge." Heather barely glanced over. "It's cute. They made it this morning. I'm not in it." "So?" Daniel felt like his voice didn't even echo in the house anymore. "Do you even see me anymore, Heather?" She blinked at him. "Of course I do. You're just stressed. You're overthinking." "No," he said, voice low. "I'm overlooked." For a second, she looked like she might respond, but Marlene wandered in, glass of wine in hand. "Is he whining again?" she said with a chuckle. "You really got to grow a backbone, Dan." Heather laughed. That laugh, it cut through him like glass. Daniel said nothing. Just turned, walked back to his basement corner of a life, and shut the door. But that night, he began to plan. He didn't have a clear idea yet. But the whisper was there. I need to leave. Not in rage, not in drama, but in quiet resolve, not for revenge, for peace. He began making mental notes, his passport, bank statements. He knew exactly where his birth certificate was stored. He remembered a friend from college who owned a cabin up north, private, disconnected, the kind of place no one would look, and most of all, he began saving his emotional energy. Not arguing, not defending himself, just watching. Documenting in his mind every small betrayal, every moment Heather looked past him, every time Marlene made herself more at home than he ever felt again. He didn't rage, he didn't shout, he just started disappearing quietly. The tension in the house had become unbearable. What once was a home filled with shared laughter and dreams was now a stage for emotional detachment, muffled arguments, and the daily chaos brought on by Heather's sister Brooke and her two wild children. By the end of the third month, Daniel had stopped recognizing the man he saw in the mirror each morning. He looked older, worn down. His eyes carried the weight of unspoken resentment, and his silence had become a form of protest, one that no one in the house seemed to hear. Heather barely acknowledged him. If she wasn't working late, she was locked in the bedroom with Brooke, wine glasses clinking, laughter erupting over private jokes that Daniel was no longer a part of. Brooke's children had turned the living room into a jungle gym. There were sticky fingerprints on the walls, spilled juice on the hardwood floors, and broken toys shoved beneath the couch. The television was constantly blasting cartoons or video game noises. One evening, Daniel walked into the kitchen and found one of Brooke's sons, Jaden, climbing on the counter barefoot, his grubby hands digging into a jar of peanut butter. Daniel's patience, thin as rice paper by now, snapped. "Get down from there," he said sternly. Jaden giggled and shouted, "You're not my dad." Before Daniel could respond, Brooke stormed in, face red with fury. "Don't you dare talk to my son like that," she yelled, snatching Jaden off the counter. "If you've got a problem with how we live, maybe you should find somewhere else to be." Heather, hearing the commotion, rushed in seconds later. "What's going on?" she demanded. Daniel, trying to maintain his calm, explained what happened. But once again, Heather took Brooke's side. "He's a child, Daniel. Don't bark at him like some dictator," she said coldly. "You're overreacting. Again." That night, Daniel didn't sleep in the bedroom. He didn't even sleep on the couch. He found himself lying on the floor of the garage, surrounded by unopened boxes from years ago, wedding gifts, old photo albums, things they once treasured together. And it was there, under the humming light bulb and the faint scent of motor oil, that Daniel realized the truth. He was utterly and completely alone in his marriage. The next morning, Heather handed him a list of errands: grocery shopping, picking up a package, getting her dry cleaning. No good morning, no thank you. Just commands, like he was a roommate who owed her chores. Daniel didn't respond. He simply folded the list, slipped it into his wallet, and walked out the door. But instead of going to the store, Daniel drove to a nearby lake. It was a place he hadn't been to in years, a place he used to escape to before he got married. He sat by the water for hours, letting the silence wrap around him like a blanket. Birds chirped overhead. The waves lapped gently against the rocks, and for the first time in months, he felt his heartbeat slow, his mind cleared. That's when the idea took shape. He could disappear, not out of spite, not as revenge, but for peace. He had been holding on to a life that was already gone. A marriage built on memories instead of mutual love. A house filled with strangers. And a wife who no longer saw him as anything more than an inconvenience. In that moment by the lake, Daniel saw two possible futures, one where he stayed and slowly lost himself, and one where he walked away and started over, quietly and cleanly. He chose the second, but first, he needed a plan. That night, Daniel began making quiet preparations. He started going through old drawers, pulling out documents, birth certificate, passport, savings bonds. He took only what mattered. Everything else he left untouched. He opened a new email account under a different name. He called an old friend who lived in Montana and asked if their spare cabin was still available. The friend didn't ask questions. "Yes," came the reply. "It's yours if you want it." Daniel simply answered, "I do," but he didn't leave right away. He waited. He watched. He wanted one last look at what his marriage had become before he vanished for good. What he saw over the next few days only confirmed everything. Brooke throwing parties while Heather pretended not to notice, the children running wild, empty wine bottles piling up, disrespect masquerading as jokes, and Heather, his wife, looking right through him like he wasn't even there. And then came the family barbecue. But that, Daniel knew, would be the final straw. I didn't know the exact moment it happened, but something inside me began to calcify. It was like a switch flipped, quietly, somewhere deep in my chest. Maybe it was the moment I realized I couldn't remember the last time Heather looked at me like a husband, or when I realized I was knocking on the door of my own bedroom, asking if I could sleep in my own bed. Nights blurred together in silence. The laughter of her sister and her kids filled the house like background noise, and I was the static no one cared to fix. Sometimes I sat on the front porch until well past midnight, hoping the cold air might numb the heat rising inside my chest. But it didn't. It never did. One Friday night I came home late from work. Traffic had been brutal, and a last-minute emergency at the firm had kept me hours longer than I'd planned. I was hoping for a quiet dinner, maybe a glass of wine alone in the kitchen, but when I opened the door, I was greeted by chaos. Toys scattered across the hallway, music blaring from the living room, and the sound of glass breaking, followed by laughter. Heather's sister, Chloe, was in my seat at the kitchen table, sipping wine from my favorite glass, like she owned the damn place. Her kids were chasing each other through the kitchen, completely unsupervised. When I stepped in, she glanced up with that smug smile and said, "Oh, look, the homeowner's back." I forced a chuckle. "Long day, just looking for something to eat. You might want to check the fridge before the kids raid it again," she said, like it was some kind of joke. I turned to Heather, who was sitting on the couch with her feet tucked under her, scrolling through her phone like nothing was wrong. She didn't even look up. That was the moment, not the chaos. Not the mess, not Chloe's attitude. It was Heather's silence. That dismissive silence. It shouted louder than any insult ever could. I retreated to the garage, sat on the old couch I'd kept since college, and for the first time in years, cried. Not the angry kind of crying, not the self-pitying type either, just silent, heavy tears. I realized I had already been grieving. Grieving a marriage that had died in slow motion, piece by piece. The only difference now was that I was ready to let go of the body. Over the next few weeks, I started making preparations. Not loud ones, quiet, intentional, strategic. I moved some important documents into my work bag. I started scanning copies of personal files, uploading them to a private cloud I knew Heather didn't have access to. I cleared out one drawer at a time in the garage, nothing that would raise suspicion. I even found a small, budget-friendly apartment on the edge of town, a studio barely big enough for a bed and desk, but it was clean and mine. I signed the lease under my middle name. I paid 3 months in advance in cash. Every move was methodical. I didn't want revenge. I didn't even want Heather to hurt. I just wanted out. Clean, quiet, free. I deserved that much. Then came the day of the infamous BBQ. I didn't know about it. Wasn't told, wasn't invited, wasn't even asked if I'd be okay with a dozen people trampling through the house I paid for. When I walked in, the smell of grilled meat hit me first. The laughter next. There were balloons tied to the fence, kids running across the backyard, music humming from the outdoor speaker system I had installed last summer. I stood at the sliding glass door, invisible, until someone spotted me. "Daniel, come grab a plate, man," Heather's uncle called. I walked out like a ghost. People clapped me on the back, handed me beers, made small talk, and I smiled through it all, wearing my best mask. But inside, I was just watching the credits roll on a movie I used to star in. Then it happened. Chloe, standing under the patio umbrella, with a drink in hand and a smirk on her face, said the words that broke the last thread holding me there. "If Daniel disappeared tomorrow, I don't think anyone would even notice." There was laughter. Real, belly-deep laughter from the crowd. Heather didn't stop her. In fact, she chuckled and added, "He disappears all the time, emotionally, at least." And just like that, the choice became easy. Later that night, I packed the last of what I needed. I wrote a note. I left the house without slamming the door. I drove to my studio apartment in silence. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was breathing air that was mine. The first sunrise in the studio apartment looked nothing like the pastel dawns that used to filter through the big bay window of the old house. It was harsh city light, cutting in at a sharp angle through metal blinds. But to me, it was perfect. No dog-eared memories sat in the corners. No ghost of Chloe's laughter echoed down the hallway. No hint of Heather's perfume clung to the throw pillows. It was an empty canvas, and I, finally, was holding the brush. I started small, a folding desk from a thrift store, a mattress still wrapped in plastic, a single cast-iron skillet. Every item I carried up those 3 flights of stairs felt like a brick pulled from the castle I used to guard and stacked instead into the foundation of something new. Nights were quiet, too quiet sometimes. I'd catch myself listening for footsteps down a hallway that didn't exist. On those nights, I opened the window, let traffic noise replace the ache of old routines, and reminded myself that loneliness is just solitude still learning its own name. Within a week, I'd built a routine. Up at 5, jogged 2 miles through streets that smelled of fresh bread from the corner bakery, Shower, black coffee, freelance work until noon. In the afternoons, I did document cleanup for small law firms. Easy money for someone who'd spent 15 years buried in contracts. Evenings were for reading or wandering used bookstores or sitting in the tiny cafe across the street scribbling thoughts into a notebook that, for once, didn't feel like evidence in a future argument. It was during one of those cafe nights that the first email arrived in the new inbox I'd created specifically to handle divorce correspondence. The subject line was a single word in all caps: notice. It was from Heather's attorney. Mr. Sloan, this email serves as formal notification that Mrs. Heather Sloan seeks an amicable dissolution of marriage and equitable division of assets. I read it twice. Amicable was rich, coming from the woman who'd laughed when her sister joked about my disappearance, but part of me felt relief. That meant she'd signed the draft agreement I'd left with my note. No contest, no request for alimony, just a proposal to sell the house and split the proceeds 50-50. I typed a two-line reply. Acknowledged. I will have counsel forward my signature within 72 hours. Then I closed the laptop and felt a strange lightness, like I'd just set down a suitcase I hadn't realized was still in my hand. 3 days later, my phone buzzed while I was running code checks. It was Curtis, my 16-year-old nephew, the only relative who'd ever bothered to text after I vanished. The message was a screenshot of a Facebook post from Chloe. Moving day, new house, fresh start for me and the kiddos, no freeloaders or negative vibes allowed. In the photo, she posed on a front porch clutching keys, Heather standing beside her, plastic smile in place. My first reaction was a laugh. Heather had put her name on a mortgage with the very person who'd driven the dagger deepest. My second reaction was cold, professional curiosity. How long before that house ends up underwater? Still, the post made my chest tighten. I'd told myself I didn't care where Heather landed, but seeing her grin next to Chloe's smug face stung. I closed the image and breathed until the feeling passed. Then I opened my cloud drive and signed the final digital documents Marcus, my own attorney, had prepared. With 3 clicks, my marriage slipped into the past tense. The next milestone came 2 weeks later in a brown envelope addressed to Mr. Daniel S. Sloan, Unit 3C. Inside, the finalized decree, stamped by a county clerk who would never know the weight those papers carried. Beneath the decree was a note from Marcus. Free at last, brother. Lunch on me when you're ready. I laid the decree on the desk, stared at it until the words blurred, and realized I hadn't cried since the night of the barbecue. Oddly, I didn't feel like crying now. I felt still, like a lake the day after a storm. Debris floating, yes, but the surface finally calm. That weekend, I drove out to the storage unit. I'd kept it paid up, unsure what I'd want to rescue and what I'd burn. In the stale fluorescent light, I opened boxes, my granddad's record player, the Polaroid camera Heather had given me on our first Christmas, a stack of ticket stubs from concerts we'd once loved. I thought I'd ache. Instead, I smiled, wound the old player, and dropped the needle on Springsteen's Dancing in the Dark. The gritty guitar filled the concrete room, and I danced, badly, alone, laughing at myself because no one was there to mock me. When the song ended, I packed only what mattered into the trunk: the record player, a crate of vinyl, the Polaroid. The rest, sofas, decor, wedding gift china, went on an online marketplace the next morning. Each ping of a notification felt like a bell tolling for the past. Life settled. I got a contract gig that covered not just rent, but savings. I spent Sundays volunteering at a community garden, fingers in soil instead of legal briefs. I learned the names of cafe baristas, of the stray cat that prowled the fire escape, of the elderly jazz saxophonist who played evenings on the corner. Then, one Tuesday, I was leaving the garden when my phone rang, an unfamiliar number. I almost let it die, but something made me answer. Daniel? Heather's voice, small, unfamiliar, echoed through the line. I just wanted to tell you I signed the house sale contract. The check will clear next week. You'll get your share. Thank you, I said, honestly. And I wanted to say I'm sorry, she continued. Not just for Chloe or that barbecue, for every time I made you feel invisible. For a heartbeat, the city noise faded. I pictured her standing on a porch that wasn't ours, holding a phone with hands that once knew every scar on mine. I forgive you, I said, surprising us both. But forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. I know, she whispered. I hope you're happy. I am, I answered, and realized it was true. We ended the call. No promises, no maybe someday coffee, just two signatures on different pages of the same chapter, finally turning in opposite directions. That night, I carried the record player onto the rooftop of my building. The city skyline burned orange, then violet. I dropped the needle again, Springsteen side B this time, and let the music spill into the warm dusk. Below, horns honked, sirens wailed, life kept moving. I wasn't waiting to be missed anymore. I was living loud enough to be heard by myself, and for the first time since I could remember, that was more than enough. It was supposed to be just another Saturday, the kind that passed like a whisper, barely remembered by the time Sunday dinner rolled around. But that afternoon, when Daniel pulled into the driveway of his own home, he immediately knew something was off. The street was lined with cars, too many for a normal day. He paused in his seat, watching as kids darted around in the front yard, chasing each other with juice boxes and half-eaten cookies. There was laughter, the scent of grilled meat in the air, and music thumping lightly from a speaker somewhere in the backyard. He hadn't been told about any of this. There were no texts, no mentions at breakfast, nothing on the family calendar. Daniel stepped out slowly, locking his car door behind him and made his way toward the side gate. Each step felt heavier than the last. He passed the kitchen window and saw Heather standing there, drink in hand, laughing with her sister and their mother. They looked like a trio of giddy college girls, not women in their mid-30s juggling motherhood and crumbling marriages. Something about their carefree laughter stung more than he cared to admit. When he opened the gate to the backyard, the wave of noise hit him like a slap. People he barely recognized were lounging on patio chairs. Paper plates overflowing with food were stacked on the table. Someone was flipping burgers at the grill. He couldn't even remember the guy's name. It was a full-blown family barbecue that he hadn't been invited to. One of Heather's aunts spotted him and waved with a plastic cup in hand. "Daniel?" "You made it!" she yelled. Made it? He didn't even know it was happening. He nodded, managing a tight smile. "Didn't realize I was late." The aunt chuckled, already distracted by someone else. He walked deeper into the yard, feeling like a stranger in his own domain. Then it happened. Heather's sister, drunk off sangria and high on attention, called out loudly as he passed the picnic table. "Oh, look! It's the ghost husband. We thought you evaporated into your man cave." A few people laughed. Daniel gave a polite smirk, trying to brush it off. But she wasn't done. She leaned back in her chair, eyes gleaming with mischief. "You know," she said, raising her voice so the crowd could hear, "if Daniel disappeared tomorrow, I don't think anyone would even notice." The laughter was louder this time. Not just a few chuckles, but real from-the-gut laughter. Some people turned to look at Daniel, expecting him to laugh along. Heather was right there, just a few feet away. And instead of stepping in, instead of saying anything, she smirked and took a sip of her wine. That was it. That one moment. The joke, the laughter, the silence from the one person who should have defended him, split something inside Daniel so cleanly it left a ringing in his ears. He looked around slowly, at the kids running barefoot through his garden, at the strangers using his deck furniture, at the woman he once loved, now just a bystander to his humiliation. Daniel raised his beer as if to toast the room, and with a calm voice that cut through the noise, he said, "Challenge accepted." The yard went quiet for a heartbeat, then a few nervous giggles. Then the conversation resumed, but Daniel had already left, emotionally, mentally. His body lingered, but his heart had started packing bags. He stayed long enough to carry a few trays inside, to pretend everything was fine, but when the last guest left and Heather went to bed with the kids, Daniel walked into his home office, opened a drawer, and pulled out the folder he'd labeled Plan B. Inside were the divorce papers. Signed, stamped, ready. That night, while the house slept, Daniel slipped into the garage, loaded his duffel bag with the essentials, laptop, passport, a change of clothes, and walked out into the darkness. He didn't look back. For most of his life, Daniel had been a man of words, kind ones, measured ones, the sort that de-escalated conflict and bridged emotional gaps. But in the days following the backyard barbecue, he embraced a different kind of communication: silence. Heather didn't realize it at first. Maybe she thought he was sulking, or maybe she believed it would pass like all their old arguments, an unspoken storm that blew over quietly. But Daniel wasn't sulking. He was done. Each morning he woke up before anyone else, brewed his coffee, and sat outside on the porch with nothing but birdsong and breeze for company. No phone. No small talk. He dressed, went to work, and returned like a ghost passing through familiar walls. He didn't complain, didn't accuse, didn't even glance too long in Heather's direction. And that, oddly enough, seemed to unsettle her more than shouting ever had. One night, Heather tried to break the silence. She leaned against the doorway of the study while Daniel was reviewing project bids on his laptop. "You're really not going to say anything about the barbecue?" she asked. Daniel didn't even flinch. He clicked something, shut his laptop, and stood up. "I already did," he said, walking past her. "What does that mean?" she called after him. He paused at the bottom of the stairs. "You'll understand soon." And with that, he climbed the stairs, leaving her standing there with confusion and a tiny seed of dread growing in her chest. From that moment on, Heather started paying attention. She noticed how the boxes in the attic had shifted position, how the safe was a little lighter. She noticed receipts tucked into the trash, storage unit payments, gas stations from 2 towns away. One day, the second key to Daniel's old car was missing from the drawer. Still, she clung to denial, until she found the folder on his desk, sitting there like a quiet threat. Inside it were documents, divorce papers signed and ready, financial statements, a change of address form, even a letter from a lawyer requesting mediation. Heather stood in the office with the folder in her hands as if it were pulsing with heat. Her eyes scanned line after line, the gravity of it finally sinking in. He wasn't just mad, he was already gone. That night, after Daniel returned from work, she was waiting in the living room. No wine, no makeup, just her, sitting on the edge of the couch like she was trying not to fall apart. "When were you going to tell me?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't sit. He placed his keys on the table and looked at her, not with anger, but with detachment. "I was waiting for the moment when you'd finally notice I had nothing left to say." Tears brimmed in Heather's eyes. "So this is it? You're just going to vanish without even fighting for us?" Daniel laughed bitterly, but without cruelty. "Fight, Heather, I fought for years. I begged for your time. Your respect, your partnership. I watched you prioritize your sister, your image, your parties, everything but us." "That's not true," she said quickly. "Isn't it?" he said softly. "Then why did your sister feel so safe making that joke? Why did everyone laugh? Why didn't you say a single word when your husband was being humiliated in front of your family?" Heather's mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. Daniel walked past her, heading upstairs. Halfway up, he paused and turned. "You let them erase me, Heather, so I gave them what they wanted. I erased myself." That night, Daniel didn't sleep in their bed. He didn't sleep at all. He sat in the old armchair by the guest room window, watching the moonlight drift across the floor. The weight on his chest felt lighter than it had in months, not because he had solved anything, but because the burden of pretending was finally slipping away. The next morning, he moved quickly. He left Heather a note on the kitchen table. Not dramatic, just 2 lines. "There's no need to drag this out. Let's finish what we both know is over." And with that, he walked out the door, the silence following him like a trusted friend. In the dim glow of dawn the next morning, Daniel sat in silence on the edge of the guest bed he had been sleeping on for months. Ironic, really, considering it was meant for guests, and he had become one in his own home. The echoes of the previous evening still haunted his mind. His sister-in-law's cruel joke during the barbecue, "If Daniel disappeared tomorrow, would anyone even notice?" wasn't just a sting. It was a final strike to everything he had tried to hold together. And Heather's laughter, the woman who once said he was her safe place, her constant. She didn't defend him. She didn't flinch. She laughed. Something inside him had snapped, not in rage, but in finality. That moment became the quiet reckoning he didn't even know he'd been waiting for. He had made his decision. While the house still slept, Daniel began moving with precision. Every step, every drawer opened, was planned. He had already been slowly preparing for weeks, storing documents, scanning photos, and transferring savings into a new, untraceable bank account under a slightly altered version of his middle name. He'd already paid in cash for a modest studio apartment in another city, a place where no one knew him and no one would ask questions. His clothes, laptop, a few essentials, and an envelope with the finalized divorce papers were all packed into a single duffel bag. On top of the envelope, he left a yellow post-it note. It simply said, "You noticed yet?" There was no need for goodbyes, no confrontation. Confrontation would mean giving them the chance to twist the narrative. This way, he would leave as quietly as he had become invisible. As he stepped out of the house and closed the door behind him, the silence felt heavier than the duffel on his shoulder. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. What was once a home had become nothing more than walls filled with cold air and stifled tension. The drive out of town was almost surreal. The roads that once carried him back to a life he had fought for now led him away from it. He turned off his phone at the first gas station and dropped it into a trash bin. Then he pulled out a prepaid burner phone, anonymous, clean, free from the constant buzz of questions he didn't owe answers to. When he reached the new apartment, it was still early. The place was sparse: a futon, a desk, a mini fridge, and a mattress on the floor. But it was his. And that meant more than anything. The first few days were a blur. Daniel worked remotely, accepting freelance gigs that kept the lights on. He bought secondhand furniture, cooked simple meals, and went on long evening walks through unfamiliar streets where no one knew his name. The ache in his chest didn't go away overnight. In fact, it lingered like a bruise you forget until something brushes against it. But slowly, it began to fade. Not because he forced it, but because space had finally given his heart room to breathe. Weeks passed, then a month. He didn't check social media. He didn't call anyone back, curiosity whispered to him in quiet moments. What was Heather thinking now? Did she even notice he was gone? But he refused to listen. He was no longer someone's emotional punching bag. He had chosen peace over performance, dignity over obligation. Then, one day, while checking an old email account he had nearly forgotten about, used mostly for subscription trials and random confirmations, he noticed a name in the inbox that stopped his breath. Heather. Dozens of messages. The earliest ones were fiery and cruel, accusations of cowardice, abandonment, betrayal. But as he scrolled through, the tone changed. The fire turned into confusion. Confusion melted into apology. And finally, regret began to seep through every line. She wrote of the house falling apart without him, the bills she didn't realize he had always paid. The chaos that became unmanageable once her sister and the kids overstayed their welcome. The loneliness she had buried under sarcasm and pride. She admitted that she hadn't signed the divorce papers. "Not because I think we'll fix this," she wrote, "but because I finally see what I destroyed." In another message, she said, "I wish I could go back to that night and stop myself from laughing. I wish I had stood up for you. I'm sorry for making you feel like a ghost in your own life." Daniel didn't reply. He couldn't. There was nothing left to say. He had given her years to see him, and she only opened her eyes when he was already gone. And he knew, deep in his bones, that love meant nothing if it only bloomed in absence. He closed the laptop, leaned back, and let the silence envelop him. Not like a void, but like a sanctuary. Months slipped by like pages turning in a book Daniel never intended to write. In his quiet apartment nestled near the edge of a sleepy town, he found a rhythm that didn't demand anything of him but honesty. No alarms shrieked at dawn. No angry footsteps or cold silences haunted the hallways. There was only sunlight filtering through old curtains, the distant hum of life outside, and the stillness of a man who had finally stopped running from others, from heartbreak, and most importantly, from himself. At first, the silence was unbearable. He would wake in the night, expecting to hear the sounds of children screaming or Heather whispering on the phone to someone she didn't think he knew about. But those echoes faded slowly, replaced by the sound of his own breathing and the ticking of an old clock he'd picked up at a flea market. He kept a journal on the nightstand, a leather-bound thing that smelled like old books and beginnings. Every night he wrote, not to document, but to release. Sometimes he wrote long passages about memory, love, and loss. Other times it was just one word like peace or enough. The truth was, Daniel had never been someone who wanted to disappear. He had wanted to be seen, heard, valued. But when every room in his house became a mirror reflecting someone else's chaos, he had realized that visibility, true soul-level presence, wasn't something anyone could grant him. He had to claim it. And in that cabin, in that town, in that new name he sometimes used to order coffee, he finally began to feel real again. He picked up odd jobs, editing scripts, reviewing books, even ghostwriting blogs for people who paid more for words than truth. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. Enough to buy groceries, to keep the lights on, to afford that one cafe in town with the good cinnamon rolls and quiet corners. He became a fixture there. The barista knew his order. The owner asked him once if he'd be interested in leading a writing group. He declined at first. He wasn't ready. But a few weeks later, he saw the flyer. Writing to Remember, Stories That Heal. Something about it called to him. That's where he met Claire. Silver hair tucked into a loose bun, eyes sharp despite the softness in her voice. She had lost her husband to Alzheimer's. "He forgot me long before the end," she'd said during one session, her voice steady. "But I remembered for both of us." Daniel didn't speak much in those sessions, but when he did, it was honest, raw. He didn't say Heather's name. He didn't mention the barbecue or the note or the months of orchestrated silence, but his words hung heavy in the room, and everyone seemed to understand anyway. One night, walking to his car, Claire joined him. "You write like someone who left a fire still burning," she said gently. Daniel smiled without humor. "Some fires aren't meant to be put out," he said. "Just walked away from." She nodded. They didn't speak again that night, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It was shared. Safe. Meanwhile, back in the city, Heather finally signed the divorce papers. No letter. No message, just a manila envelope delivered to his P.O. box. He stared at it for a long time before opening it. The finality didn't sting. It soothed, like a thorn finally pulled after months embedded deep in skin. On the one-year anniversary of the barbecue, Daniel sat by the lake, the same one he'd discovered on one of his long walks. The wind was crisp, the sky an impossible shade of blue. He took out his journal and wrote just one line. "I was never disappearing. I was returning." He closed the book, set it beside him, and leaned back on the grass, arms outstretched like someone who had stopped asking for permission to exist. He thought of Heather, not with hate, but with a strange tenderness, the kind you reserve for things you once loved but outgrew. He hoped she found what she was searching for. Maybe she already had. Maybe she never would. That wasn't his burden anymore. He had made peace with not being missed, with being the man people laughed at and dismissed, because now he was the man who laughed alone, unafraid, unconcerned, and finally whole.